Don't be afraid of open source. Use open source. Apply open source. Contribute to open source.
Love
and
it.
with this,
Love it.
My nice Christmas.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Verisian Community Podcast. I'm super excited to introduce my next guest. Her name is Katja, and she's one of the most active community members in the pharmaceutical space, especially leading a lot of efforts on open source and promoting those efforts. She is a community manager for the OpenStudyBuilder project, which you should definitely check out. They have a Slack community. You should definitely reach out to her. She also is very active in the working groups at Fuse, promoting different open source initiatives, and she does a ton of consulting work, having worked at Bayer for some time. But you should definitely connect with her after the episode. But I hope you enjoy, and let me know what you think of the episode. Katja, good evening. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you on. I've known of you and seen your work for such a long time. So it's such a pleasure and privilege to learn more and share some of your work with the wider community. So I guess just to dive straight in, you're so active in the open source community within clinical. Can you tell us a little about what inspired you to become such an advocate for the rest of the community?
Yeah, I started my career within the Fuse community, meaning I started joining the conferences, and it's always such a great atmosphere to talk to people. We are all doing the same, and I really enjoyed a lot to talking to these people. And we're having then also these working groups where we did some stuff and working on some stuff. But then the next step is really not just talking about principles and processes, but really doing stuff. And for this, I'm really becoming very passionate about this open source. And this is also where I just started, okay, this is what we need to do as a next step. So first step is really communicating, collaborating, and discussing. But the next step is really to share also our tools and doing it in open source.
And can you tell us a little about your journey in open source? I mean, you sometimes I feel like you're everywhere, both online and offline, in terms of the working groups and the different projects. But are there specific projects that you feel inspired you to go this direction? And can you tell us a little bit about sort of your journey towards that?
Actually, there hadn't been a really specific open source project. Of course, I like to use open source tools like GIMP and such stuff. But then on the other side, I experienced, so the first thing we need, there are already open source solutions available. So first thing I thought, okay, there must be a project which is be very useful, which I could do, which I would like to do in open source. And then I drawn a picture on, okay, let's do something for the Define XML to have a tool for this. And then I had been talking to a colleague of mine about this idea. And he just asked me, hey, don't you know this Define XML editor? And so, what? There's an open source project available? Oh, yes, it's a friend of mine. He's doing it. So that really surprised me. So the first learning I'd been thinking about a useful open source tool just to figure out, okay, there is already something out there. So this made me disappointed. Okay, before I'm doing an open source project, it might be even more valuable to make people aware about what is available already, because this is our first problem we have. There is already something, we just don't know. And this is how I get started. And this really brought me an initial wow moment, because there is something already I hadn't been aware of, and I just could use it, and this had been pretty cool.
Open source, obviously, in the wider software industry has existed for a very long time, but in clinical, it still feels something new, something disruptive, perhaps. What do you think are the defining characteristics of open source? Because, in my view, it's a lot more than just putting source codes out there, putting a license of it. It's got a lot more of that community aspect. But what are your thoughts on how open source is characterized within the wider Fuse and clinical development community?
Yeah, open source is much more about just putting source code somewhere. It's about collaboration, getting feedback, and seeing the tools utilized by various different use cases. It even starts with something small, like when we're working on clinical studies, we are having our own programs, which we use for us own. But then we just share it with our colleagues. And this is the first thing where we start collaborating, getting feedback in, and seeing, hey, just by sharing it with my colleague, I get also a lot of additional input on how it could be better and enhance it and make it more flexible to have better outputs. And scaling it up to the open space really enables us to do much more, to gain much more feedback, to solve much broader problems than just our own. So this is what really make it so disruptive, because you really could broaden the scope for whatever use case you have and make it available. Because if you don't have something to choose from, then it's really bad and you just have to do it all on your own.
I think we sort of touched on this. I mean, obviously we had dinner with a few friends of ours at the Fuse in Copenhagen, which I think we had some really good sushi there. Was it sushi? I think it was sushi.
Yeah, it was sushi.
It was sushi, right? Yeah, it was really nice sushi. But I think what's interesting and what's particularly sort of defining in terms of within this particular part of the clinical development value chain, so to speak, is that traditionally it's so closed, obviously, because it's IP and trade secrets and all of that. But that open source is synonymous to try to share as much as possible to at the end of the day, because we're all programmers and we're all trying to do right for the patient. And that cultural aspect is the sort of the disruptive thing that goes against being secretive, not sharing, not collaborating, which is really interesting yin yang, that sort of the forces that pull on each other's ends. And I mean, I would congratulate you on all your efforts that you've made. I think you're one of the global advocates for open source in general. And I want to talk about obviously about OpenStudyBuilder, which you've been pioneering and been such a great champion about. Tell us a little about OpenStudyBuilder. Where did it start? Where are you guys at? And where's the future going?
Yeah, with OpenStudyBuilder, we started also with a collaboration project, which is the CDIS 360 project, which just pointed out the vision. So, I mean, we are still having our standards, but we are still stuck with so many manual processes. And this is really so cumbersome still. And I mean, we've been working in this space for many, many years, but we are still lacking all this automation. And for this, the CDIS 360 vision was started. And then luckily Novo Nordisk decided not only to implement something in their company, but they decided to do it open source. And as I've been advocating open source, I got the lucky position to support this open source project. And by now I'm even community manager, meaning I'm trying to convince others that this is a really good solution, which we can use and which we can collaborate together on. So that's the ultimate goal. So that we having a solution, which is a really complex one. So it's really meant to design your study protocol in there, to manage all your standards in there, and to grab all the information for all the following processes, whether it's defining your CRF, setting up your CRF and your EDC system, but also getting your data structure, like for SDTM, how it looks like and so on. So it's really meant to support the end-to-end processes in a fluent way. So this digital data flow we are all talking about. And the end vision is really excellent, because when we have not only the standards which are used for integrations, but you also have a tool, you really can practice. Okay, so when I put my study in here, I get this standard out, and this I can connect to the next system. And if it's public, then it's much easier to do all these integrations, which we currently are struggling also a lot with. Because it doesn't help if we have one solution where we have the information in, but then create a document to put the information again into another system. So that's really excellent about the OpenStudyBuilder, to really have the opportunity that it really flows. But of course, we need integrations, and we need also other extensions, tools, and collaborators to really getting this to be a success. And I'm very excited to be on board.
I mean, that's amazing. And so in that journey, especially now in your role as community manager, and I think you're also one of the most active contributors to the project on GitLab, I think you guys are on.
Yeah, but actually the team consists of around 40 people. And it's really everything from design to implementation to also integrations within in-house systems. And actually, I'm only doing the OpenStudyBuilder communication, meaning the project homepage. And I'm also having insights because I just install it locally and also give some kind of first level support when it comes to Slack communication. But actually coding, I'm not doing. But we are having such a huge team, and they are very specialized. And next to the pure coding, it's also a lot about implementing tests and following the guidelines and the rules so it's all aligned. It's quite much.
It's quite the endeavor, yeah. And what do you think have been the biggest challenges in, I guess, convincing people to join firstly and second to adopt?
I think the first problem, and this is where we are still struggling with, is the OpenStudyBuilder is such a huge tool with influencing many different functions and departments. And the question is, okay, if you want to jump on the OpenStudyBuilder, where to start? Do you start with a study protocol, or do you would like to use it as a metadata repository system? Or do you really are looking for the complete digital data flow? It's a lot. And if you want to do it internally, it's also many departments are involved. So it's difficult to find a person or a group who's responsible, and then also convincing all the colleagues that this is the way forward. I mean, specifically when it comes to the protocol part, when changing from a Word document to really structured content, this is something the protocol writers, of course, don't like, because before you are free and flexible and can write whatever you want, and now you should choose between specific pre-selected building blocks and also clicking your schedule of activity together instead of free writing. It's a huge difference and it's a huge challenge. And because of the high complexity, it's also difficult to get others on board.
But you've been quite successful in doing so. What do you think the secret is to a thriving open source community? Just thinking a little bit more meta.
I think it's very important to have presence and to have contact and also to gather feedback. But on the other side, the community must also provide feedback, because if you don't get anything feedback, then you do not know what's missing, what should be done to support the community better. But specifically in small scale, getting feedback is of crucial importance, and it's really nice. And if you have a tool which you can just play around with and try it out, it's also much more easy to get feedback. So people don't have to install something. They just send, for example, for the OpenStudyBuilder an email, and then they have access to the playground area. And then we also have very easy communication channels like Slack. And also we do have community meetings. So this direct contact, I think, is also very important, and being very present at these conferences so that people are aware of this tool, know where it stands, know what the vision is, so that they can understand of whether it is something they want to do or not.
What do you think have been the most successful conferences? You mentioned, I mean, I sort of have an idea, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where you find most of your community.
I'm grown up with the Fuse community, so this is my personal favorite. But on the other side, of course, I am also like the CDIS conference, because it's then very focused on the CDIS standards. It's a different scope. So whereas on the Fuse community, you more have the users and really the people working on the clinical studies. And on the CDIS conferences, you're more talking to the people defining the standards, managing the standards, and having these standard discussions. And as I'm located in Europe, so that's mainly my area.
Yeah, and I mean, and there is a lot. I mean, we saw each other, I think, in Strasbourg as well, where Fuse obviously had the biggest EU Connect so far, 700 people. It was quite the venue, I must say.
Yeah, that was really, really lovely.
And you guys had a booth with the OpenStudyBuilder, I believe.
Yes, we had been available at the COSA booth, so the CDIS Open Source Alliance, and we are part of COSA, and there we could present on the open source solutions we have around CDIS standards, and OpenStudyBuilder is, of course, one of it. And we are also very happy to be part of the CDIS 360i project. So this is a new project coming up, also managed by COSA and CDIS, and there it's really about implementing the CDIS 360 vision.
So looking at other open source more generally beyond the OpenStudyBuilder, obviously everyone allegedly still uses SaaS, but how much do you think is going to take away from SaaS in the future? And as a follow-up, is there scope to have a submission in Python in the next 5 years?
This really depends on. So I think R will become more and more successful just because of all these open source solutions. Because, I mean, traditionally, companies have their own standards in SaaS. So they might have macro system standard programs, which they use from one study to the next study. And for this, they became very efficient. But on the other side, when we now have more and more R packages available, which makes us very efficient in the R environment, then depending on wherever you are more sufficient, so this is where you will likely will go. So as soon as we're even getting more and more problems and probably also maybe complete submissions done in R and more guidance on how to use it, more examples, more use cases. So this is where I see more and more people switching to R. Going to Python, this really depends on, because as long as we are not having those Python open source package, we will not switch to Python. But as soon as also Python will have complete packages for mappings, for table listing figure generation, or for other interactive stuff, that might be coming, but really that needs, of course, also an investment. And this investment has to be done. So it started, of course, all with Admiral. So this was a huge boost in the open source space for R. But now we're having so many different packages, and the Pharmaverse is also a nice organization to organize all these packages in our area. But even beyond there's so many. So I really would think that R is becoming more and more public and more used. But in the end, I'm not 100% sure. It really depends on this return of investment, right? I mean, if you're having very efficient SaaS processes, you might not switch to R unless the R processes become more, cheaper in producing your results.
This might be a bit of a controversial question, but I speak about this a lot to my friends who work at SaaS. I mean, you know them from the conferences, especially when you go to PharmaSoc. Half of the conference is sponsored by SaaS, but half of the talks are about moving to R, which I always find sort of difficult for when I speak to the SaaS salespeople, and obviously some of them can get defensive. But how would you recommend to a SaaS on how they should stand out for themselves? I mean, they've done such a tremendous job in building an ecosystem that is truly impressive. But obviously, when you go to these conferences, sometimes it just really feels about moving away from SaaS, and there is this negativity sometimes around it's expensive and it's archaic. How do you think SaaS should, or I guess, how do you see the role of SaaS in the next 10 years vis-a-vis up and coming, or
I think it really depends on where we stand with the functionality. Because if SaaS would have open source solutions, then I would expect much less people would consider switching from SaaS. And I mean, the programming language is one way. I mean, the big advantage SaaS still have is its status as a validated environment. So, I mean, what they are doing, and this is also how they are marketing, they say, okay, just use our environment and you can run our script, but you're still in our validated environment. So it's a huge standpoint to have really this complete setup and this complete backend. On the other side, of course, it would help also a lot when there would be more development on open source SaaS packages. I mean, they tried, for example, with the Define generation program. They had been, I forgot the name, but then they laid it down. And also, I have to admit, in the very beginning, they struggled with creating graphics. And for this is where R became initially important, just to create fancy graphics. And the ODS graphics are a fantastic feature and it can do a lot, but it came out too late. So maybe listen to what the need is from the customers and then implement these things. For example, for R, we now have different opportunities to create RTF tables, but creating RTF in SAS is easier, but still sometimes you struggle, whereas in R, you now have more and more options.
I think you make such an important point there. I mean, the whole movement in clinical is community driven. And all the packages are community driven. And obviously SaaS, being a large enterprise with various interests, of which obviously life sciences is one, you do see a delayed adoption despite salespeople being at most of these events. And they're great people and I enjoy speaking to them, but they have little say in product development. And so I think you're absolutely right in that staying close to the customer, the user more so, because the customer typically is someone else within the organization, and the user is typically separated from the person actually signing off on their multi-million dollar contracts. But yeah, no, I'm a big fan of anything that works, regardless of. But it is true, the R community in nature is community driven, which in the end will lead to just better solutions that are better suited for what is necessary. Speaking more generally about the future, are there specific innovations that excite you the most for statistical programmers?
The shift to open source, of course, is a core development, which I really love. And I'm also looking forward. I mean, maybe there will also be more in the SAS space, which I really would love, because SAS is also a programming language I really like. So this is really going to be very exciting. And then as we are sharing more and more those programs, I'm curious on where we will land. So for example, how I could envision the future is really having a landscape full of solutions. And then you can just plug your solutions together. So if the interface in between the solutions are somehow defined by standards, you really could easily switch from one tool to the next one. Like, for example, in the pharmaverse, wherever I'm doing my evaluations, I can plug in either this RTF creation package or that RTF creation package. It's just depending on my personal lead, I can use a package which I prefer. So, and this opportunity to choose between different things that are available is amazing. So we really could build custom solutions, even though we have a common process flow and common solutions.
All of these initiatives, right, in open source in particular, are really the result of just people getting to know each other at the conferences or building those real life interactions, which are so important to build the trust to build these communities. But what do you think is the role, or in your own words, how do you see the role of these communities, both in terms of single day events at Fuse, CDIS conferences, because they do seem to get bigger and bigger every year? What's the next 5 years going to look like, in your opinion?
I'm convinced that the communities will grow and that the communities will specialize. So it's not possible for one person to oversee all those single projects which are going on. So I would expect that the community you will have people being in different communities to oversee it. And then you have specialized ones which are really sitting on specific projects to drive them forwards, which is what we need. Because to put source code out there is a thing you can do, but this is not a real open source community project. You really have to get the feedback, have to do enhancements, have to accept changes, and really, having a continuous maintenance model.
And I guess with that, how do you see open source? And if we take this to the extreme, 10 years from now, what's the potential that open source can have in terms of redefining how we generate TFLs, how we do submissions? What's your vision? If you were to do anything that you know you wouldn't fail, how do you see the future?
I mean, in the end, it's all about data. So we could update or upload our data to the authorities, for example. And then, because we do have an open source landscape, these tools are triggered automatically. So just by having the CDIS formatted data sets, you could kind of get your initial set of tables, listings, and interactive displays and play around with them. On the other side, of course, you need to dive into specific things. So I would see the future that specifically for safety, as these are standards, this is for something which will flow automatically. And then the teams internally in the companies can really concentrate on the efficacy and on these very special things. And on the other side, what we also see is due to the new opportunities, there are also always new requirements. So we will definitely, by now it's required to provide our tables and listings, ideally in PDF format. But in the future, I would hope and expect that we are switching to really modern formats like browser style stuff. So where we really can interactively going into these things. But of course, unless it's open source, fully transparent, fully validated, it's difficult to think about something like this. And for authorities, of course, they also don't want to have for each vendor different apps they use. Ideally, and this is kind of a requirement, it should be something public, something transparent, and something usable by everybody. So this really could change our way of working a lot.
You're so right. It almost feels archaic to deliver static based information in the form of tables rather than dynamically updated or dynamically searchable information that is fully traceable. If I can do a plug, that's sort of what we're trying to do at Verisian, but that's for another conversation. As one of the final questions that I'd like to ask this, what have you changed your mind on in the last 1 year that you didn't expect to change your mind on?
Maybe AI. because here I really had been very...
I thought we wouldn't get through this podcast without talking about AI.
Yeah.
But...
No. You have to talk about AI, don't you? I have been also very motivated. I did some tests, so I haven't been super excited about the opportunities. But during the last Fuse conference, I really had been thinking about the environmental impact, which I didn't in the past. And this really frustrates me. So really seeing in the end how much just a simple AI call costs with respect to power. And this is kind of strange. So this is a major, change of mind when it comes to what has changed. And I got the AI into the podcast.
No, I love it. I was thinking about, by the way, but you do make a really interesting point. And I do think there is an opportunity for someone to build a software that really tracks that consumption, because it's so hard to, because you look at some big pharmaceutical companies, they have such strict budgets of how much you can fly. And even I know some very senior directors really hate it, because sometimes they have to travel for a conference and they're forced to take the train, when in fact they much rather fly. And so, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some companies deliver these types of measurable dashboards in order to track your AI CO2 footprint, so to speak. Because I mean, it is an energy game, and you see this with all the investments that the big tech companies are doing. Well, it's a real privilege to have you on the podcast, Katja. I just wanted to say that I congratulate you for all the work you've been doing in the community. I really feel sometimes you're really everywhere, online and offline. I hope to see you next year at some of the upcoming conferences. I'd love to give you, I'm wearing my Verisian hoodie. If for anyone listening to this on Spotify or on Apple iTunes, just on YouTube, I'm showing off our Verisian hoodie. Would love to send this to you. And is there, as a plug for the OpenStudyBuilder, where should people head to if they want to connect with you and the wider project?
To get started with the OpenStudyBuilder, of course, we do have our project homepage, where we are really having all the resources linked and videos, demonstrations, and so on. We're also having a Slack channel, and you can also reach me in LinkedIn. And what's very important, provide feedback about open source, whether it's the OpenStudyBuilder or whether it's any other open source project, because this feedback is really valuable. And as an industry, we are currently quite quiet, which is not what is open source about.
I love that. Katja, thank you so much for your time. I wish you a wonderful rest of the evening. I think you're going to the Christmas market in Berlin. I think a lot of people will be very jealous of you that you can just go to a market in a real true German Christmas market. Any final message to our listeners before we wrap up the episode?
Also, thanks for having me here, Thomas. And don't be afraid of open source. Use open source, apply your open source, contribute to open source.
Love
and
it.
with this,
love it.
Nice Christmas.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you and to everyone, of course, who's listening. Thank you so much.
Thanks too. Bye.